So picture this. A president imposes massive new taxes on practically the entire country. The economy is, thrown into chaos. And the legality of the whole thing? It all comes down to a single word that isn't in a 50-year-old law. This isn't some political thriller movie plot. It's a real Supreme Court case, and we are going to break down exactly how it all went down. Everything kicked off with this presidential proclamation in early 2026. The White House, citing a national emergency, did something pretty dramatic and, well, unprecedented. They imposed these sweeping new taxes, we call them tariffs, on a huge range of imported goods. The idea was to completely reshape international trade. And look, we are not talking about small change here. These tariffs meant a multi-billion-dollar shock to the economic system. This affected pretty much every business that imports anything, and, by extension, every single person who buys those things. The stakes were just enormous. Okay, so here is the central mystery. To pull this off, the president used a law from 1977 called the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or IEEPA for short. But here's the thing. If you go and read that law, one word is just missing. The word tariff. So how on earth could the president claim a power that Congress never actually wrote down? That's the exact question that landed in front of the Supreme Court. So in this explainer, we're going to walk through the president's big claim. We'll unpack the powerful legal tool the court used to look at it, we'll dive into the fierce debate that happened inside the court, reveal the final verdict, and then we'll look at what this landmark decision really means for the future. All right, Section 1, the president's tariff power. So how did the administration even begin to justify such a massive move? Let's take a look at their core legal argument. The government's lawyers pointed right to this phrase in the law. Their argument was that the power to regulate importation is this huge, broad grant of authority. And somewhere tucked inside that huge power, they said, is the implied power to tax those imports with tariffs. To them, a tariff is just one of many tools you can use to regulate trade. It's a simple argument, but an incredibly bold one. Now, to figure out if this bold claim was legit, the Supreme Court turned to a really powerful and kind of controversial legal idea. You can think of it as the detective's special toolkit for sorting out these huge fights between Congress and the president. It's called the Major Questions Doctrine, and the basic idea is actually pretty simple. Congress doesn't hide elephants in mouse holes. If Congress wants to give the president or a federal agency the power to make a decision of massive importance, something with vast economic and political significance, it has to say so clearly. A vague or general phrase just won't cut it. Now, what's really cool is how Justice Gorsuch explained this in his opinion. He used a super simple analogy. Imagine parents tell a babysitter to have fun with the kids. Does that permission slip mean the babysitter can just decide to take them on an unplanned, multi-hour road trip to an amusement park? Of course not, right? And why? Because that babysitter is acting as an agent with delegated power. An extraordinary action, like a big road trip, requires extraordinary permission. It's not just common sense. It's about the basic rules of delegated authority. But here's where the story gets really fascinating. The justices themselves couldn't agree on what this doctrine really is, or even how you're supposed to use it. This case suddenly wasn't just about tariffs. It became a full-blown battle over the fundamental rules of American government. In his opinion, Justice Gorsuch actually identified 3 separate philosophical camps on the court. Each one had a totally different take on the Major Questions Doctrine. And, understanding these 3 camps is really the key to understanding this entire case. So first up, you have the purists versus the pragmatists. Justice Gorsuch, who is the purist, he sees the doctrine as a fundamental constitutional rule. It's like a shield that's designed to actively protect Congress's power. But Justice Barrett, the pragmatist, she sees it differently. She argues it's not some special rule at all, but just a common-sense tool for finding the most natural reading of a law. Basically, a way to avoid interpretations that just feel off. Then you have the third camp, the skeptics, and their view is captured perfectly by this quote from Justice Kagan in an earlier case. She basically called the doctrine a judicial invention that just magically appeared out of nowhere to tie the hands of the executive branch. In this case, Justice Kagan argued the court didn't even need the doctrine. She said that just by using the normal ways of reading a law, what she calls straight-up statutory construction, it was obvious the president's tariffs were illegal. But Gorsuch had a really sharp response. He pointed out that when Kagan and other critics started talking about the unparalleled authority the president was claiming, well, they were actually doing a major questions analysis. They were using the logic of the doctrine even while claiming they didn't need it. So you've got this deep intellectual divide. And to make it even more complicated, there was a fourth group, the dissenters. They didn't have a problem with the major questions doctrine itself. Their problem was with how the majority was using it in this case. Justice Kavanaugh, writing for the dissent, argued that IEEPA did provide clear congressional authorization. His whole argument rested on history, saying that for centuries, the power to regulate importation has always been understood by Congress and by the courts to include tariffs. So from his point of view, the majority was ignoring all this history and was instead demanding magic words, that the law had to literally say tariff when the context made it clear enough already. So, after all that debate, all of that intellectual sparring, where did the court finally land? Well, the mystery was solved.
In a 6-3 decision, the Supreme Court struck the tariffs down. The precedent, they ruled, had gone too far and exceeded his authority. The tariffs were officially declared unlawful.
So the big question is why? Well, the majority's reasoning really boiled down to 4 key points. First, and most basic, the power to tax belongs to Congress. That's a core principle. Second, when Congress does hand over some of that power, it uses really clear language and sets firm limits. IEEPA doesn't have any of that. Third, that vague word regulate is just not a clear enough green light for a massive multi-billion-dollar tax. And finally, history was a big deal. In the 50 years IEEPA has been on the books, no president had ever tried to use it this way. For the court, that brand new, totally unheralded claim of power was a huge red flag.
But the story doesn't just end with the verdict. A Supreme Court decision this big creates massive ripple effects. It impacts the economy, the government, everything.
The ruling answered a major legal question, sure, but it opened up a ton of new, practical ones. Like, what happens to the billions of dollars that have already been collected? And what does this all mean for the balance of power in Washington, D.C.? The real-world impact comes down to 3 things. First, refunds. All those businesses that paid these illegal tariffs, they may now be entitled to get that money back. And again, we're talking billions. Second, a new boundary has been drawn. The court made it crystal clear. Future presidents cannot use this specific law to impose tariffs. Period. And third, a power shift. This decision marks a major reassertion of congressional power, basically pulling authority over trade and taxes back from the White House and putting it on Capitol Hill. But, getting that money back is not going to be easy. The court's ruling didn't spell out how refunds should work. And as the dissenting justices themselves warned, figuring out who gets what and how is probably going to be a bureaucratic and legal mess that could take years to sort out. So in the end, we're left with this really fundamental question. Was this ruling a vital check on an overreaching president, protecting the core powers of Congress? Or was it an example of the court tying the president's hands, making it harder to act decisively in a future crisis? The case itself might be closed, but this major question about power and where its limits are is one we are going to be debating for a very long time.